Yes, now we are live.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning across the Atlantic. It's great to be here with those of you who are tuning in regularly. And for those of you it's first time, welcome to the Atlantic Forum's NATO 2030 discussion series. For those of you who are indeed tuning the first time, the discussion series is designed to provide a platform for a new generation of transatlantic leaders and experts to discuss main areas of cooperation and to discuss also security issues related to the North Atlantic Alliance. It's currently our fourth edition of the NATO 23 series, and I'm really delighted that this one will be focused on the NATO southern flank, following from our discussion a month ago, which was focused on the eastern flank. And in this regard, I would love to give the floor straight away to today's moderator, which is Megan Giscon, who's our very own editor of the Atlantica magazine and also a researcher at the Istanbul Policy Center. So thank you all very much for joining us. Those of you who are joining us on LinkedIn, on YouTube, on Facebook, and we all very much look forward to the discussion. Megan, over to you.
Thank you, Igor, for the introduction. As Igor introduced me, I'm Megan Gislin, and I'll moderate today's panel. I also want to, again, reiterate that I'm the editor for the Atlantic Forum's own online magazine, Atlantica, just so that I can, put another plug in for our lovely magazine and also encourage all of our patrons that are watching to keep a lookout for our monthly call for papers. So today, of course, we're here to discuss defending NATO's southern flank. While NATO allies along the southern flank, namely Greece and Turkey, which joined NATO in 1952, are some of the alliance's oldest states, the challenges that specifically impact the southern flank are constantly evolving. Among these challenges include combating terrorism in many forms, addressing maritime security, dealing with the effects of migration and climate change, as well as the fallout from instability along NATO's southern borders, including the Northeast or the Middle East and North Africa. And then, of course, rising great power competition, among many other threats. In line with our series title, NATO 2030, we also want to adapt a forward-looking posture in order to better assess the threats and challenges in the lead up to NATO, or in the lead up to 2030. And then without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speakers to give some initial remarks, and then we'll mostly focus this conversation on discussion and questions. So first we have Roger Hilton, who is a Defense and Security Research Fellow at GlobeSec. And today he's joining us from Vienna. Then we also have Tanya Latich, who is a policy analyst at the European Parliament Research Services, and also a NATO 2030 Young Leader. And then we also have Savannah Lane, who is the Executive Director of the Turkish Heritage Organization in Washington, D.C. This is just a reminder to our viewers to please submit your questions in the comment sections of our Facebook stream. And then without any more further ado, Roger, if you can please start off our conversation on the southern flank today.
Hi, Yasu, merhaba, bonjour, hi everybody. Megan, thanks for taking the time to moderate, and more importantly, thanks for Atlantic Forum for hosting everybody today. I want to start off the conversation today a little bit differently. You're probably asking yourself, what is a Canadian living in Vienna, working in Bratislava, doing a little bit of time in northern Greece? So I want to first start off just basically giving you a rundown about Thessaloniki. I didn't know a lot about the place when I moved there to begin with, and I thought that was very helpful for everybody. So just to begin with, the name Thessaloniki itself is derived from the name victory over Thessaly in 353 BC, which I think was just an awesome sort of name for a title, the bordering province. Very known little fact about Thessaloniki, it's the birthplace of Kemal Ataturk. The most important word or concept you need to know about Thessaloniki is halara, which is the art of doing nothing and enjoying life, which is very, very easy to do in Thessaloniki. And if you're a local in Thessaloniki and you want to live like one, you drink Freddo espresso and Sapporo, which is sort of really great ouzo after work, of course, when your shift is in. And this all leads back to why I was in Thessaloniki to begin with. So I was a civilian working at the Nato Rapid Deployable Corps in Thessaloniki. And this is an organization that is designed to do both Article 5 and non-Article 5 response operations for long periods. It's one of 9 high readiness forces in the NATO Lang force structure. And the highlight for me working there was I got the opportunity to participate in 2018 in exercise Trident Jaguar, which is just something I'll never forget. It was a 1,300 personnel operation in a sprawling military complex of 26 nations. Every day working on interoperability, foresight, strategy, towards one mission success. And I think that really speaks volumes to NATO about having everybody working on the same page from different countries where, you're coordinating with people from France, from Albania. And that for me was one of the most important takeaways, not just working at the NRDC and the exercise, but in general, what NATO is about. So, I think that's one important point to communicate. And the last interesting point about Thessaloniki and the NRDC is the motto of the base is to cut the Gordian knot, referencing back to Alexander the Great. And that's really important because this is, a very hard problem. It's complex, but at the end of the day, NATO and its allies and partners, there is a solution to it. So I hope Megan, Tanya, and Savannah, we have the opportunity to sort of try to solve and cut that Gordian knot. And it's really a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Roger. And now we're going to jump to Tanya, who is our panel today, NATO EU expert. So Tanya.
Thanks so much. I hope you can hear me well. Obviously, Roger is a very tough act to follow, particularly after delighting us with his promotion of the art of doing nothing. I'm afraid I don't have any such anecdotes prepared for today, but I will try. Well, I'll speak in a personal capacity today, and I'll try to make 3 brief points just to kick off the discussion in these first 5 minutes that you've generously allocated me. So I'll talk first about the what, the who, and the how. Very easy, and then hopefully I will have given you enough food for thought and provocative thoughts for a discussion. But so first, the what. When we think about the southern flank, we generally think Mediterranean, but then we also think North Africa, we think Sahel, we think Sub-Saharan Africa. These are extremely diverse territories that amass 1.3 billion people, comparatively much more compared to NATO and EU populations, right? Just to set a bit the tempo of what we're really talking about here. So therefore, I think discussing any sort of future strategy for the South has to either take into account all of the complexities that each of these countries are facing, let alone the intrinsic nuances of the countries themselves. But rather than doing that, I believe that it will be much more productive to focus on NATO's political role and NATO's supportive role in the region. Now, I don't see currently any appetite or any indication really for NATO to play a truly leading role in the South, because today the focus is simply too fixed on territorial defense and deterrence, much more than it used to be even a few years back. Now, let me be clear, that is not a bad thing. I really don't think that's a bad thing, on the contrary. Now, Megan, you've also asked me to say a few words about the threat environment, which is also very much the what. What are we really talking about? And every policy event that we attend, every policy paper almost that we read these days tells us how unpredictable and how complex our security environment has become. So it's a cliche by now to say this, but that doesn't make it any less true. So the threats to 2030, if that's our timeline, will become more complex, and they will continue to give us a full show of breaking news, which basically is just show us what is broken is really the silos which we use to currently classify the threats to our security. So I think these threats are going to be merged much more into a threat continuum, if you will. But the key point here is I think that before we figure out how to become resilient to such threats and how to practice much more inclusive security and inclusive governance at home, it will be very difficult to do so credibly and legitimately abroad, because we're still quite a long way from doing so at home. So yeah, and this is very much related, I think, to all of the current discussions at the NATO level and in the policy community about democratic values, how they fare in NATO, democratic resilience. So I think they're all very much connected. So that was briefly on the what. Now, second, the who. No, unfortunately, not the 70s band, the who. I think we're old enough to know who they are, but rather who should do what in the South. And I'm certainly of the opinion that NATO has a great deal of expertise to share, to assist the countries in the South. And I think NATO itself would benefit enormously from those countries to improve its own situational awareness. So I think that NATO's role in the South should be very much focused on lessons learned, on dialogue, on training, on security sector reform, and on assisting other international organizations with its own unique NATO know-how to assist them in fulfilling the same shared goals that they have when they indeed are shared. So I'm talking here about the UN, I'm talking about the EU, I'm talking even about some coalitions. And again, I think we need to start to think more holistically. Again, this has become a cliche, but it is true. And this is the point we've also emphasized very much in our NATO 2030 Young Leaders report. Every challenge faced, from climate change, from terrorism, hybrid threats, each of them need an all hands on deck approach. And this applies at home and also abroad in the so-called out of area. And this is what we need to get right. Now, my third and final point, those who know me and who follow my work, and Megan, you've said it as well, know that I'm an ardent supporter of EU-NATO cooperation. And that's really not because I work for the EU and because I'm a NATO 2030 young leader, but it's for a very simple reason, which is that simply our threat environment today does not give us the luxury to pick and choose. We have to do it all. So I was very glad also to read on the website of NATO's Southern Hub that on one of their main pages, they quote a very old African proverb, which surely you've seen on countless motivational memes on social media. And it says that if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Now, also, if you look more into the work of NATO South Hub, you'll see that they very much advocate for this holistic and collaborative approach to the South at all times. So this is obviously music to my ears. And this is the first step, to recognize this. The second is to realize that NATO by itself cannot possibly address all of the security challenges in the South, and nor should it. NATO is simply not the answer to all problems, and it doesn't have to be the answer to all problems. And when discussing these topics, I think it's really important to be careful to not overextend NATO's mandate. And this is, again, another point we emphasized in our report. Simply, the South for NATO is a secondary priority. It's clear. And again, that's not a bad thing. And I think even China is about to overtake it, given where the discussions are going. So I think that instead we should really be spending our energies on partnerships. And that's the key word here, on identifying who is best suited to lead action X and action Y, who has the best instruments for that situation. How can the others support them in pursuing commonly shared goals? Now, for instance, the UN is the closest partner that the EU has in crisis management and peacekeeping. I think that NATO should join and form a triad so that they can together address all of these goals. Well, most of their goals are shared, so that they can together address them much more comprehensively. Yes, political obstacles clearly still exist, and they do hamper cooperation in the field. We see that very clearly in maritime security. But to do so otherwise, to not cooperate, to resign, to not identify ways to support each other, that is the real duplication, and that is truly not sustainable if we are serious about achieving comprehensive Euro-Atlantic security at home and abroad. So those were my three brief points for now. Thanks, Megan.
Wow, classic, didn't unmute myself. Thanks, Tanya, for your remarks on the cooperation in the South. And I think that also going through the whole kind of, we could say, large, I guess, broad focus of the South, it is really important to keep in mind, of course, we can't do all of it, but well, we can at least discuss maybe doing all of it today. So without any more comments from me, we'll jump to Savannah, who can focus on the southern flank for us and also sort of from a Turkish perspective.
Sure. Well, Megan, thank you so much for hosting this to the Atlantic Forum. Thank you for having us. I am sure I can speak for the audience in saying that I am really eager to hear from the continued remarks from the other panelists and learn from you all today. So Roger, Tanya, thank you for sharing this. And, just a brief background, although the organization that I work for those who are not familiar with it, we focus on the analysis of the US-Turkey relationship and the NATO alliance. I am not Turkish, so I will do my best to provide the Turkish thought and perspective, while at the same time recognizing that I am coming from an American perspective and will no doubt have some criticism from that viewpoint. So I also would like to share, just a personal anecdote. I think it's safe to say we are all, let's say, NATO nerds here. And I think the best birthday present I ever got was a few years ago with NATO and the summit in Washington, D.C., and being able to join the NATO Engages panel and hear from all the thoughts there and Madeleine Albright. So it was an exciting opportunity. And I think just the dialogue there is something that we will look to continue to do over the next few years. And so I just want to provide a very brief background and insight to open up the conversation. Tanya, I'm sure you and I will be in agreement for a lot of this, because I think an emphasis on EU and NATO cooperation is absolutely critical moving forward. But in understanding where we are today, it's no question that we are in an ever-changing world. I think most of us are not in our office right now. And so with the isolation of COVID quarantines, the global pandemic, I think we have seen now more than ever the need for international cooperation and collaboration. And even though we are, working remotely or the world may seem paused, unfortunately, the regional disparities, regional disputes, the rising tensions in the southern flank, as well as outside external powers growing in strength and adversity, is something that didn't stop, even though we sort of paused in working in terms of the typical day-to-day activities. So that NATO framework is, I think, something that will really need to be emphasized, especially in the framework of cooperation. I'm sure we all have been following closely the edict set forth by NATO 2030 and the United for the New Era analysis. So I think, Secretary Stoltenberg really put forth these outlined phases that I think are a really important framework to understand NATO and where we are today. So first, this idea of the phase of collective defense, moving past this into the projecting stability phase through the understanding of crisis management and partnerships, and then moving forward into this third phase, which I think we find ourselves now in understanding that there is no room for one or the other. We have to have both efforts for collective defense and management crisis to promote stability and project stability beyond the borders of regional areas, the southern flank, beyond NATO. It's really not only needed, but required today. It's no question that NATO has faced its challenges just like the rest of the world. Turkey's role within NATO, of course, has been recently questioned, which I'm sure we will talk about more in today's program. But the current threats that NATO faces are ones that we simply don't have the luxury to spend time solely within the confines of NATO and the regional disputes, which there are plenty, no doubt. So having the understanding that there are tensions that exist within NATO, but to understand that we have to continue the efforts as aforementioned in projecting the stability and the phase of collective defense and security to move forward. Now, a quick note about what we will be primarily focusing on today with the southern flank. NATO has consistently enduring interest in the South. This is not a new phenomenon in reaction to difficulties or rising tensions. NATO is an alliance of sovereign nation states, as we all know, and many within are in that southern tier, that southern flank. And so when thinking of the importance of NATO in the southern flank, I think it's important to recall 2012 at Chicago, the NATO summit, in which leaders declared this first operational step in the ballistic missile defense program. And through this, Turkey, of course, as we know, hosted a US ballistic missile defense radar. But this step, as was very clearly outlined in this movement forward, was not in reaction to Russia, but in a reaction to protecting that southern flank. And that was a goal that was a recommitment to the protection of the allied states in this apparatus as a whole, and in diplomacy and defense in that specific region. As we all know, the phrase, when NATO's neighbors are more secure, NATO is more secure. So I think it's important to reiterate that the emphasis and the interest of NATO to the south is not just a reaction, but with the naval operations of Russia in the Med, Russian role of Syria, there are legitimate security concerns and interests of NATO that need to be continued focus on. Then, as Megan, as you brought up, the idea of failed states, the idea of migration. It seems like the problems never end, but it's something that, because of these continued layers of difficulties, the regional instability, the political fighting in the region or within NATO itself, they have to be, I don't want to say put aside, because I think it's extremely important to address them, but they cannot linger as they have for decades and decades. I think that, to focus and put that emphasis on far more worrisome involvements from Russia, from China, non-state actors alike, and the shifting tensions in the region is something that we will have to continue to put emphasis on and addressing, and it's something that will continue to grow in the years to come. So I'm looking forward to hearing the remarks from the other panelists, and I do believe, as kind of, I think we've all foreshadowed so far, this idea of cooperation, of NATO and EU cooperation, dialogue and transparency is really the way forward through a lot of these more difficult topics and themes. So thank you.
Thank you, Savannah. So I guess, since mentioning the more difficult problems between the NATO member states, I'm going to sort of dive right in with one of those, which is, of course, the conflict and operations in the Eastern Mediterranean. Of course, there's many disputes and many activities. The East Mediterranean is always a big, important geopolitical region, and especially since the past 10 years with the conflicts in Syria, and of course the migration crisis that's spurred from that, and it's an important area for the EU as well. So I kind of wanted to first start with Tanya, and the Eastern Mediterranean is, of course, a main area of cooperation for NATO-EU relations. In your opinion, is there a way, or are there more specific areas in which NATO can increase cooperation in the Eastern Mediterranean with the EU? For example, NATO is coordinating it to some capacity with the EU and conducting Operation Sea Guardian. And then what else can either the EU or NATO contribute in order to enhance this cooperation in the region?
Thanks, Megan. It's not an easy question, but yeah, as I said before, I think the political role of NATO is really absolutely key here, and it has to be emphasized much, much more, particularly in the Eastern Med, but as I said, in the South more broadly. I think in the Eastern Med, NATO's political instruments and its convening capacity has proven its potential to bring all these relevant actors to the table, as we've seen with the deconfliction mechanisms a few months ago. Again, I think, and you've said it yourself, cooperation with the EU here is absolutely essential, because it's essential because we need to design a compromise that is based on incentives that all actors are able to respond to. And for this, you need to have, again, a comprehensive approach. For instance, just yesterday, the EU Council, so that's the EU member states, have approved an integrated EU strategy for the Sahel region, right? This is a bit away from the Eastern Med, but it's still very much relevant. And I'll get to that. I'll connect the threads. Now, this is a strategy, I'm just giving it as an example. It's a strategy where about a region where clearly NATO has a clear interest, because NATO allies are involved militarily, very heavily so. On this region, this strategy emphasizes civil efforts, it emphasizes short-term stabilization, it emphasizes long-term prospects for peace, it looks at efforts for counterterrorism, for security sector reform, but for promoting in parallel good governance, anti-corruption. Now, these are all elements that are in the interest of NATO in the region, in the broader region, including in the Eastern Med, but also in the Sahel. Another example, coming closer a bit to your question. Also yesterday, EU member states approved another strategy, this time focused on so-called renewing the relationship and the partnership with the Mediterranean, so the southern neighborhood. There in that strategy as well, we see an emphasis on resilience, very much a buzzword on in both sides of Brussels, as we like to say, NATO and the EU. So there's this emphasis on resilience. There's an emphasis on better linking all of the instruments to be able to engage in conflict prevention and stabilization, in crisis management, but as well as in post-conflict situations, including through the EU's missions and operations, and including through, stated very clearly, cooperation with NATO. So on the EU side, you see that there is very much this willingness to engage and very much this willingness to promote this holistic approach to the South. And again, I haven't mentioned these to give you a lecture on what the EU is doing. I can do that at any other moment, but not now. But it is to answer your question, because NATO's role in the South and in the Eastern Med, respectively, should emphasize the political and should, I think, be governed by a fundamentally civ-mil approach. And by itself, we see, I think, time and again, that military support only or a military approach by itself will not be conducive to lasting peace and stability. And in the Eastern Med, a military approach is not the right approach, I think. I am fairly convinced. So I think now we do have an opportunity at the moment that has to be seized to be much more long-headed in the EU and in NATO be long-headed for common security, essentially, which very much includes the Eastern Med. And this is as we go through NATO 2030, the revision of the strategic concept, and as the EU goes through its strategic compass. And finally, final point here, and I'll stop after this. Of course, political obstacles are very clear. And you mentioned cooperation between Sea Guardian and Operation Irini. I think it leaves a lot to be desired from this cooperation. Sea Guardian used to cooperate much more closely with Operation Sophia, but now because of political difficulties, cooperation with Operation Irini, which has replaced Operation Sophia in the central Mediterranean, is really not that smooth because of political obstacles. So even though these naval operations, as you said, I think share most goals and even at times have overlapping tasks. So there's a lot of duplication at the moment, which is caused by politics. Naturally, solving these issues is a precondition for effective cooperation in the South, and that probably starts with the Eastern Med. But again, emphasizing NATO's political role and working more with the EU politically, I think, can certainly help facilitate.
Thanks, Tanya. I couldn't agree with you more about the civil-military cooperation and taking a dual approach. I mean, not only because, NATO is, of course, both civil and military alliance, but these are very complicated issues that have stemmed, interchangeably go back and forth. What's sort of the chicken or the egg? Are they civilian-related problems, military-related problems? So I want to jump to Savannah and sort of focus in on the Turkey aspect of this issue. Of course, we see the main two NATO allies on this issue are, of course, Turkey and Greece, not to mention, of course, a number of other issues between those two countries that have been, sort of since the dawn of time, issues, not excluding who invented baklava, which we won't get into today, but always a fun debate. So going back to the Eastern Med, we saw NATO get involved in the fall and establish the deconfliction zone or hotline between the two member states. I guess my question is sort of, how do you see NATO's increasing role in the Eastern? Obviously, I don't want to say obviously, but I think it's obviously very, very positive in this regard. It's held up pretty well since the fall. How do you see NATO and Turkey, or NATO, Turkey, Greece sort of increasing cooperation throughout time, and I guess enhancing crisis management, NATO's crisis management role in the Eastern Mediterranean?
Sure. Well, first, thank you for making me hungry. Baklava is, of course, a delicious treat. I would eat all the time if I could. And you certainly bring up an important point. I mean, Greco-Turkish maritime disputes, and I will preface this by saying I am no maritime law expert, although I have worked with a number of colleagues who have enlightened me in many of these more nuanced specifics of the conversation. But I mean, you know, Turkish and Greek maritime disputes have been around since the genesis of time. I mean, since the founding of these two states. So understanding that these are really couched in competing narratives, this idea of national sovereignty, this bigger picture within the Eastern Mediterranean, and understanding that backdrop with what we are currently seeing in the challenges and the driving factors behind this dispute. Of course, I think, as you alluded to, the NATO involvement is fantastic. I mean, we're seeing the need for cooperation. The struggle, I think, in a lot of understanding this, difficulty with Turkey's new regional and foreign policies and securities in the region is based on this, Blue Homeland Doctrine. Cem Gurdeniz, who I've worked with as a colleague, understand the nuances of that conversation, but still the implementation of these doctrines have caused some serious incidents and fallouts that have been, stemming from Turkey's allies and adversaries alike. So while some of these are important, and especially as we've discussed throughout the theme of this conversation in limiting Russian influence, there are still some aspects that are very egregious and aggressive, and they have pretty much been largely accepted because of this. So having this understanding of escalation, which could essentially challenge and did at some points challenge the coherence. I don't think it was the aim, but it did challenge the coherence of the collective defense of NATO, especially in the Mediterranean. This overall weakens political cohesion. So I think having this understanding of now seeing this stopping point, as you mentioned, of where we are now, the NATO involvement, the importance of relying on allies, even though there are tensions, and disputes that are existing. The bigger picture is the focus. So I think in understanding the need for allies to approach this instability with especially with the Mediterranean, in this integrative policy of understanding that there has to be a de-escalation of tensions and a definition with both Turkey, with Greece, with all of the major players, these common interests that we have in the Eastern Mediterranean of defending NATO's southern flank, understanding what is the bigger picture here. So how do you do this? Tanya had mentioned and alluded to this in some of the 2030 reports and kind of the plan moving forward, but this consistent articulation of a clear approach is really based on understanding, how do we define this projecting stability? What is stability? How do we define what is the status quo and what isn't the status quo? And it's not just, you can't just, frame it in the sense of the NATO or Western framework. You have to incorporate these important allies that have potentially, different regional goals. And so defining what is that stability and what is every single key player's role in this is going to be how you maintain that political focus, building up military preparedness and response for the southern flank is going to have to continue, because we are seeing both traditional and non-traditional threats alike. The growing presence, as we've discussed consistently, of Russia, China, to a lesser extent, non-state actors, et cetera. So having increased dialogue, whether it be with the EU, incorporating, let's see, a revitalization of the Mediterranean dialogue, the ICI, a number of different avenues for discussion. And it might seem rote or, just easy to say, oh, well, it's all dialogue, it's all discussion, but having a dialogue and discussion that is clearly definitive of understanding what the goals are, defining the goals, defining how NATO even defines stability in the region, and how you work in terms of projecting stability and that collective defense for things that, look, we're not seeing a slowdown of the influence of external actors, of external allies and adversaries in this region. So if we're going to continue in seeing the momentum that we have thus far, we don't have a choice but to see increased cooperation and dialogue. And I think, I'm a broken record here, but seeing that you can't do it alone. Having NATO and the EU work together, having an understanding of the cooperation that this requires, not just, we want, but it absolutely requires, is going to be that future of NATO in the region. I think Turkey is a key player, obviously, in that. And, it's something we've discussed in bits and pieces here, that there are tensions within the US-Turkey relationship, undoubtedly. There are tensions within Turkey and the NATO relationship, undoubtedly. And of course, there are, disputes between Greece and Turkey. But looking at the bigger picture, looking at these key allies and the needs for the strengthening and cooperation of this definitive, coherent plan is what's going to need to be a focus moving forward. And we really can't afford to waste any other time with the political infighting and regional disputes.
Thank you, Savannah, and again for the emphasis on cooperation. So we'll see how that goes in the future. So Roger, I kind of want to focus on the Eastern Mediterranean and kind of ask you about the sort of migration landscape in there. If there's anything that you see that NATO could do to improve its sort of I don't want to say combating migration, but I guess providing more secure paths towards migration and a secure posture in general in the Eastern Mediterranean, and what NATO can do to improve that, given that the Eastern Mediterranean is, of course, I don't want to say hotbed, because of course migration channels are constantly fluctuating now, but in the past 5 years, we've seen it as a significant channel. And I mean, even just today, you read the news, you can, you can find instances of like dozens or hundreds of people dying trying to cross through the Mediterranean. So how can NATO secure the Eastern, or I guess the Mediterranean in general in terms of migration?
Yeah, thanks, Megan. And just to chime in, I mean, Tanya and Savannah, there's really not much more to say in terms of it. I mean, Savannah, I'm so happy you brought up the Mediterranean dialogue. It seems sort of an old concept that needs to be dusted off. But maybe allow me, Megan, before I get into it, to be like a bit of a, in German you say Brandstifter, somebody who's being a little bit provocative. But I thought it was really interesting when Tanya sort of said that the Mediterranean was not the top priority for NATO, and that NATO shouldn't overextend its mandate. And in general, I tend to agree with you, Tanya, that the Mediterranean is not the top hard security priority for NATO. But really, I mean, if you close your eyes and you look at the African continent, it is a groundswell of trouble that is just picking up steam right now, whether it's climate security, whether it's human security, food insecurity, water security. And I thought it was just it might be a bit shorted by NATO's perspective just to say that it's not the top priority right now, because for me, I see this as being the #1 soft security threat. And whether it's migration, Megan, which we're talking about, where 2014, I think really legitimized what this looked like. It caught everybody off guard. And of course, they've made improvements. You've had NATO working with the EU. And one issue that I hadn't heard anybody brought up, which was quite interesting, is how recently as March of 2020, NATO re-upped more dialogue with the African Union, which I actually think is quite important about sort of importing resiliency, capacity building, early warning systems. But just going back to sort of the migration, even now statistics from the International Migration Office are talking about how despite ports being closed and airports being closed, smuggling is still up. There's a lack of economic opportunity, and people are also fleeing for their lives, whether it's for terrorism or for some of the other issues. So, I mean, from my perspective, not overextending the mandate is actually selfish. Where, I mean, right now is the time to double down and to try to get into Africa more to be there more prevalently, to train more, where possible, mitigate climate security risks. I mean, we take for granted the criminality that takes place over gas, gas that's traded in refugee camps. And I think sort of NATO has a role to project more stability and install more stability in partnership with organizations like the EU and the African Union and through the Mediterranean dialogue. I mean, even for me, I mean, it's just so shocking that Slovakia, for instance, a landlocked state that has very little connection to Africa, is part of the EU training mission in Mali. So I think preemptive policies is a super important part that NATO needs to take up, because if we play this conversation in 2030, who knows what the geopolitical landscape will look like with political instability, the climate disasters that are going to happen. So I think in addition to NATO being more active in preemptively, I think also the training and the exercises need to reflect this, where there needs to be more disaster relief exercises in the Eastern Mediterranean, evacuation to a certain degree. And also, like you said, NATO can't do this alone. It shouldn't be doing it alone, but it needs to bring all this expertise in, which is why the hub and your African proverb was so important about working with others, about building early warning systems and getting ahead of it early. Because if we just kick this down the road, and there are other major security issues, Tanya, you're 100%, whether it's the North Atlantic, the Baltic, or the Arctic, There is miscreant activity going on with China and Russia, but I don't think we should take our eye off the ball and really need to focus on sort of the soft security issues that can turn into an avalanche very quickly in the next 10 years.
Yeah, thanks, Roger. And I guess also to keep going through the question, and also if Savannah, Tanya, you would like to respond, but first I'm going to kind of ask something small to Tanya, which is, I guess the focus on the South, I was reading through in preparation for this, the Reflection Group's report, and then also the Young Leaders report. And I mean, there's definitely way more of a focus on the South in terms of, I guess, more hard security issues in the more senior Reflection Group report. But of course, going back to what Roger was saying, that climate change and these threats to human security, water security, these are all sort of intertwined, and also a grave consequence for the South if something's not done about them. So then I guess that kind of feeds into the Young Leaders report or emphasis on climate change. So I guess how do you see, how should we kind of look at the South in the future, and how do you kind of see tomorrow's leaders looking at it? Do you see it more of a climate change approach, and then therefore kind of encompassing these more soft or human security and climate security? Or do you also, I guess, see more hard security tactics also? I mean, I guess which one do you see as more pressing, or should we not even prioritize which one is more pressing, that everything is pressing? So.
No, sure. So you're perfectly right when you say that everything is pressing. And through my remarks, I by no means meant to indicate that NATO shouldn't pay attention to the South. Certainly not. I just think that it's time to be honest and say, okay, what are our priorities, and how can we shape our policy to add more value? And I think that NATO can add more value to boost security in the South by partnering up with like-minded international institutions. So this was kind of my overarching policy recommendation. I think the South at the moment is objectively, not my personal opinion, objectively is secondary. The focus is on hard security and territorial defense. Again, this is not my view. This is just my analysis of the political climate in the alliance at the moment. The focus is on resilience. The focus is on geo-economics. Just look at the Secretary General, how much he emphasizes this economic security aspect in his speeches, in the press conferences, and so on. The focus is on withdrawing from Afghanistan. If this is not a sign that the South is a secondary priority, I don't know what is. So again, by playing this supportive role, I think NATO could add more value. And in the meantime, it should focus on all of these things that it's focusing currently on democratic renewal, on resilience at home, because I want to double down on the point that I made, that until we are resilient at home, and until we take care of our own backyard in terms of alliance cohesion and making sure that we're all on the same page, that we adhere to the same values, that we agree on what are our security threats and priorities, until we do that, we cannot be a credible partner in the South. We cannot comfortably and legitimately and credibly assist our partners there. So again, my proposal was to have a much more holistic approach and team up, partner up with the African Union, as Roger said, with the UN, with the EU that are already present there. See how can NATO's unique perspective add value through military assistance, through training, through the political influence that it can play. You have to, I think, look at it from all perspectives. It has to be an all front offensive, if you will. Look at the relations between the European Parliament and the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. How can you use those fora to better connect to countries in the South and to their parliaments and to their politicians? As I said, it's all a continuum. It's a threat continuum, it's a political continuum. So NATO by itself cannot do it all, because the military is not just the only answer. So to come back to the second part of your question, which is more related to our report, indeed, we focused a lot on climate change, and we focused a lot on the CivMil approach and on the need to reconceptualize security. And this is exactly what we mean here, that we need to look at it from all perspectives, and that NATO has a role to play in climate change, even though it doesn't have the the mandate to do that. It can still use its current instruments and its current political added value to play its part in promoting or in fighting climate change, in promoting resilience. One of the main ideas that we also proposed in the report, which is the very first recommendation, is a rethinking of burden sharing. If you rethink what burden sharing means, to move from a very hard security perspective to a much more inclusive one that includes post-stabilization efforts in the South, fighting climate change in the South, conflict prevention in the South, and so on and so forth, which again would demonstrate that you do care about the South and you don't only care about tanks in the eastern flank. I think that would already advance the debate to a much more realistic and less idealistic debate as regards NATO's role in the South. So that would be my my reply and my answer.
Great, thanks, Tanya. Well, I guess I'm going to shift the focus a little bit more broadly to larger geopolitics and how the southern flank and NATO cooperation fits into this. So this is kind of mentioned, I think, particularly by Savannah, the great power competition. It's the, I guess, one of the most talked about discussions in all international relations at the moment. And in particular, how does this reemergence or new emergence of great power competition in particular impact NATO in the South? There's lots of discussion about how Russia in particular is affecting the South and the Mediterranean, as well as Libya, of course, Syria, sort of basically I don't want to say every conflict, but there's the multitude of conflicts that are like affecting NATO's southern flank sort of have some sort of Russian element if we relate it enough, or if we just even look at it very broadly. And I guess I'm going to first jump back to Savannah. We can also, I guess, open up this discussion, not even to the Mediterranean, but the multitude of domestic issues within Turkey. How has this sort of great power competition in particular affect Turkey? We can see that, of course, jumping, I guess, up to the Black Sea, Russia's military buildup there, and concerns not only, of course, Ukraine primarily, but also Turkey being a Black Sea member state, and also Turkey has a large operation in Libya as well as Syria, where it often comes face to face with the Russian forces, as well as in general, Turkey has a large presence in Africa, and speaking to increased cooperation in Africa and with the African Union, how can Turkey sort of work towards this, since Turkey has a great soft power outreach to Africa? And then, of course, I guess going from the China perspective, in line with China's Belt and Road Initiative, there's a significant, especially in recent years, significant uptick of Chinese investment in Turkey. And so I guess is there a role for NATO? Are these things that Turkey kind of has to work out for itself? How can Turkey work within or without NATO in sort of making sure that it doesn't succumb to sort of Russian and Chinese threats?
Yeah, wow. There's a lot to unpack here, and that's great. No, Megan, you've given me a lot to work with here. So I'll do my best. I was jotting some notes down, but I'll do my best to cover it all. And if we need to do some follow up, or if Roger and Tanya want to weigh in here too, I'm happy to hear from them. So let's take it back a little bit. Understanding that in this region, large parts of this southern neighborhood are characterized currently right now by, and let's be realistic, the fragility and instability and insecurity. And that was noted in many reports. This is not just new news. Instability in Libya, Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, as Tanya was mentioning, and this continues to also generate from these aspects. Illegal migration, other security threats and concerns, both felt by NATO, by the EU, felt acutely throughout Europe, but especially those allies like Turkey surrounding and bordering the Mediterranean. So what is NATO's role in this? What is Turkey's role in this? But I also want to focus on, the elephant in the room that we've discussed and kind of alluded to here, but I think it's important to just hit head on, is that there are major tensions and schisms between Turkey and NATO. And Russia has quickly capitalized on these fissures between Turkey and NATO, offering to assist Turkey in a number of capacities, whether it be managing the YPG along the Turkey-Syria border, as we all know, selling the equipment and what is now the acquisition of the Russian-made S-400 surface-to-air missile system. So understanding how this impacted Turkey's role in the F-35 program, the US-Turkey relationship, I mean, these are massive components. So then we think about this confusion, let's say, between Turkey and NATO, the instability that is growing from this confusion led by Russia, the economic and military heft of China, both to an extent in the Mediterranean, but of course in Africa, as we are seeing. So knowing that there is not only an influence of these growing regional powers, growing superpowers, let's say, that are at least hopeful superpowers, and then caught in the middle is Turkey. And I think what's important to know is that when speaking with people in more of a grassroots level, an understanding of the level of mistrust that is high within Turkey and its allies is something that we need to face head on. But understanding in the conversation, many of my colleagues shared, we understand that our priority is NATO, our priority is the US, but Russia's our neighbor. And I think that's important to realize, is that Turkey is put in a very difficult geographic region where they have Russia, they have the Eastern Mediterranean, they have the MENA region. I mean, there's so much that we could continue to say here. So what do you do about it? I think first and foremost, as we've continued to say, we must combat this bigger picture of the growing influence of Russia and China in the region, especially obviously the growing presence and pressure from Russia on its neighbors. Understanding that to the south, these challenges from Russia have presented with exploiting these regional fragilities. And it's not just Turkey. I think it's important to recognize that, but Turkey does have a role. These interventions in the Syrian civil war, China's influence with the Middle East, not just in the Mediterranean, these are all components that we have to address. So within NATO, first and foremost, reconvening and understanding that Turkey's position when it was first in NATO in 1952 is vastly different from Turkey's position in the world now. I think it's no question that NATO's allies, myself included, have been concerned with Erdogan's walking back of many of the, let's say, democratic values or beliefs, human rights issues. So that's an obvious given. But I think understanding that Turkey is a different entity than what started in NATO in the early years. They are now an emerging regional power that has different priorities in a personal security concern. So recognizing that, you have to understand where Turkey is now, what their security concerns are now, and how it plays into NATO is something that I think will be serving NATO and the alliance well. In terms of Russia, I think it's obvious that there needs to be this continuation of the dual track approach of deterrence and dialogue. But I think it's also an important aspect of responding to Russian threats and hostile actions. I mean, we are seeing continued aggression right now building as we speak. I think having this response is going to continue to be necessary to determine this political, unified, coherent way forward. And how do you do that with at the same time, Turkey's acquisition of the Russian-made S-400 system? That is still being determined. That is still being, worked out within both the U.S.-Turkey framework as well as the NATO framework. And I'm curious to see, President Biden and Secretary Blinken's continued dialogue with that, as well as Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg's comments in terms of that framework. But I think it's also important to recognize that there has to be a coordinated strategy and safeguard against China as well. It's not all about Russia's influence in the Eastern Mediterranean. It's the more subversive and less obvious Chinese infiltration and influence in the region, as well as Africa. So recognizing that we are having to address not only Turkey's role, but NATO's role, EU's role. I loved the cooperation and reminder with the African Union as well. That's critical. But understanding that we have to have entities that can meet 21st century needs. These are not the age-old challenges, although they play off of them, certainly. We have to meet these 21st century needs with the developing technology and technological sharing capabilities, the importance of utilizing, as Tanya mentioned, with Secretary General's emphasis on geo-economic security. And why is that important? Well, certainly because of the rise of other economic powers that threaten the entity of NATO and EU cooperation. So having all of those elements as a priority and focus is something that we have seen in the reports, but it's about putting it into practice, taking it off the paper, putting it into practice, having these proposals in real time. And as I've said before, we don't have the luxury of continuing to ask, well, is Turkey within NATO? Should Turkey be removed from NATO? Whether you believe that or not, and there are reasons to have these concerns, I don't disagree with that. But if you read actually one of our recent reports from Dr. John Kasapoulou, it talks about, okay, well, let's think about what if Turkey was removed from NATO? What if Turkey was, no longer part of this? What does that next day look like? And I will tell you, it's not good. So I think that criticism is fair, criticism is important, but when you're discussing the bigger picture of these great power threats that are reemerging, we don't have time to waste. And certainly I hope that continued collaboration and cooperation between both the US and Turkey, the US, Turkey and NATO, Turkey and Greece, and all of these entities will continue to develop.
Thanks, Savannah. I mean, certainly lots has changed since 1952. The threats are constantly evolving, but of course, I guess one thing to emphasize is that, Turkey's geography actually never changes. It's still next to Russia. It still has to take into these individual security concerns for sovereign states. And I mean, that's ultimately why Greece and Turkey joined NATO, is because the US and UK were extremely concerned about the position. And still today, we face similar concerns. And then I guess going on to Greece, I'm going to jump to Roger. And I guess I wanted to sort of focus or ask you about, Russian and Chinese threats that not only to Greece, but also the, I guess, wider Western Balkans region along the southern flank. And particularly, of course, China has a big economic foothold in the Western Balkans. Is this sort of should we see this cooperation, 17th 1+1 initiative, as good in terms of, I guess we'll go good or bad or more gray areas in terms of, while it's providing economic stabilization, or should we kind of be concerned with China's reach in that region? And then, of course, still Russia is always I guess, constant fixture in this region too. What sort of threats should we look from in the Western Balkans, in Greece in particular?
Thanks, Megan. I guess it's my badge of honor today just to sort of be a bit difficult and push back. But, from my perspective, I'm not totally convinced yet in my assessment that this great power rivalry going on in the Mediterranean is as pressing as everybody says it is. I think there are other areas, whether it's in Asia or the Arctic, that are actually more, center focal points for whether it's for Russia. And I think China, before I get to that, has so much on its plate right now with the Quad really being formalized. But just very quickly, Savannah, and I'll, more than happy to get Tanya or your input on it. I mean, for every option that Turkey has to work with Russia, I think that the West equally has wedges to drive between Erdogan and Putin. I mean, you go back to the Crimean War of 1851 and 1853. I mean, both of these countries really remember bad blood. So I mean, I think the relationship on a personal level is what keeps it together. It ebbs and flows. Right now we're in a good spot. We're talking to each other, but not so early ago when Turkey shot down the MiG. All of a sudden, we're a very pro-Atlantic, transatlantic country. So I think it comes in ebbs and flows a little bit. Just to bring up a couple of areas that never get enough attention from my mind is Russia and Turkey are on completely diametric opposite sides when it comes to Syria, where Russia has spent tons of blood and treasure. They've just expanded Tartus. Which completely goes against the interest going back to the earliest times of Turkey with Eisenhower when they asked if they could invade Syria. Libya, they have a huge dispute going on right there. There's a competition for resources, which is another wedge. I couldn't believe when I was researching this that it wasn't so long ago in the Black Sea, Egypt and Russia had naval exercises sort of as a signaling and posture against Turkey. So that's kind of hard to ignore. And sort of the big issue right now on the continent is Ukraine. The Turks have been completely unwavering in their support for Crimea and its illegal annexation. There's the Muslim, sort of the Muslim connection component there. And there was an arms package recently. I mean, what could be worse than Turkey supplying arms to, what Russia considers as their number one enemy right now? So that's that. When it comes to the actual, prowess of military hardware in Russia, I think, obviously they've had to scale back in terms of their investment. They've invested a lot more in smaller ships with higher level capabilities. It's kind of hard to ignore now technology where you can be sitting in the middle of the Caspian with the Caspian flotilla and shooting high precision missiles at NATO forces in the Mediterranean. So I think the dynamic has changed a little bit. And they also have a lot of submarines coming down the pipeline. They've commissioned some submarines. This whole paranoia, which could be true or not, about a cobalt missile and all of the sort of advanced technology they have, I think is something we have to reckon with. But in general, I think the Russian naval forces are stretched quite thin if you think about sort of their bread and butter being in the Black Sea and then having to cause trouble or be very miscreant in the Baltic, in the North Atlantic, or as well in the Arctic. So, I mean, you have to ask yourself, is this really the priority? They don't have a natural port right now. Super interesting historical fact, at Yalta in 1945, Stalin tried to get the ports in Tripoli. This has been a long running dream of Tsarist Russia to have something right on the Mediterranean where they have Tartus, but it's not at all what they need to accomplish a lot of their issues. And the other interesting one geographically is how they now have the port of Sudan, where they just had a call. They just signed a 25-year lease. And then you have China, who's also there in Djibouti. The last part on China, Megan, which again, I don't know, I'm just not convinced on it, is I think the veneer on China's subversive, geo-economic statecraft, I think it's off. I think sort of it's well known, the debt diplomacy, the entire world itself is in an economic downturn. China's not able to get any repayment on this. Yes, they can sign it, they can convert these into physical assets, but that doesn't help anything at home. And I think one other issue when it comes to China that is working for them is that I think, unfortunately, the rollout of the vaccine through COVAX in Africa has been very slow. And it's kind of hard to ignore the sort of the soft diplomacy that's been going on by China and Russia about delivering vaccines there, whether it's Sinovac or Sputnik 5. And I don't think you should underestimate what a big deal that is, because, I mean, even from Canada's perspective, Canada has purchased way more vaccine than we need per capita, when what we could have been doing is putting that into one fund or doubling it up on COVAX and to help the developing countries. So I think right now that's really the advantage where they have for China and Russia and the Mediterranean. When it comes to the Western Balkans, again, I mean, they've already been quite successful. In what part of Europe would you have thought that Serbia was the country where you could go and get a roster of different vaccines delivered, which I think has been a great PR success. Here in Austria, you have workers going down there, trying to get vaccinated. But I think, again, when it comes to priorities, where is the value added for them to spend resources in the Balkans right now? I mean, like I said, we're in an economic downturn. And it doesn't have the same levers of influence versus the West that I think it used to. I think everybody in the Balkans, Albania, North Macedonia, they still are unwavering in their commitment to join, Euro-Atlantic institutions, with many of them already being part of NATO. And I think when it comes to China, again, in Greece, the one major issue is their sort of strategic control of ports, whether it's in Rotterdam, Piraeus. I think they also have some controlling stake in Trieste in the Adriatic. So, I mean, I think that's the major issue. But long term, I think both of those countries have so much on their plate at home and sort of these bread and butter issues that I don't think the juice is worth the squeeze a lot of the time for them to be spending resources in the Mediterranean. So definitely a threat, but not at the high, paranoid level that I think a lot of people think it is.
And Roger, I just want to jump in here really quickly because I agree with a lot of what you're saying. And first of all, I think it's so a few things that you brought up. The Crimean Tatars is a huge aspect of influence from Turkey, and that priority there and reassurance of and support to Crimea. Another thing that you brought up, and I think it's optimistic, and I think that's a hopeful thing that I don't want to disagree with in terms of kind of yes, we're outlining this really important strategic understanding of the threats in the Eastern Mediterranean, but maybe they're not as doomsday as we are making it appear. So I appreciate you bringing in kind of more optimism there, and I'm hopeful that, you know, with things like debt diplomacy and understanding of maybe less of, as outlined, the economic heft of China, we're seeing still threats. I think in terms of something that you pointed on that I really wanted to touch on, though, was something that I meant to share from Megan's response, and that when you have all of these difficulties within the Eastern Mediterranean, whether they are the highest priority or not, I think preventative practice and diplomacy still needs to be put into place with cooperation from NATO, EU, AU, in general, whether it's from COVID to addressing, you know, regional instability and everything in between. But the one place that, you know, we haven't quite talked, you know, too much about, but the importance of cooperation that I think does point to that hopeful example thus far has been the cooperation in the Black Sea so far. And so I think you bring up some really key points there. And I appreciate you sharing more, let's say, hopeful framing of what we've been discussing. And I want to reiterate that I do agree in that sense. So I can't speak for Tanya, but I don't want my comments in focusing in on the Eastern Mediterranean, the Mediterranean, the southern flank, to be, let's say, doomsday, as we might have come across.
Yeah, well, I guess, Tanya, do you want to chime in there on great power competition? Where does the EU sit in all of this? What is your, I mean, also, we did have, I just wanted, like, a side note, please do submit your questions in the chat box on Facebook, or feel free to ask your questions. But we did have one question on the Western Balkans, so I kind of want to also, like, veer towards that in the sort of expand the question a bit. Is there room for cooperation there with the Western Balkans and the EU? How does this play into great power competition? So give us your assessment, please.
Oh, sure. I mean, all of you, Megan, Savannah, Roger, you painted a very comprehensive geopolitical picture. So I agree with many of the points made, so I will certainly not duplicate as a principle, but perhaps what I could add, and to also not sound like a broken record, but I really think that transatlantic alignment and solidarity is really the best antidote for all of these issues that you've mentioned, particularly the Russia-China issue. What Russia and China do separately and together, sometimes in the Euro-Atlantic space, is directly connected to what they do in our neighborhood, which is the topic of our discussion. At the same time, Russia and China, they also watch each other very closely, and the relationship between them is often very tense and has a very volatile and complicated history. So they are certainly not allies by choice in most issues, I think. And this is something that we often forget and that we often take for granted, given when looking at our own alliance. And I'm saying this because basically when we are divided as an alliance, when we allow these actors to sow divisions, and when they do so, then we as democracies, we debate these divisions, we display them publicly for everyone to see, and they take advantage of this. Then we see, you know, Russia and China sitting back, eating popcorn and bonding over our misery and our discord over the divisions that they sow between us. The answer is abstract, but it is still valid. It's more unity, more dialogue, and more consultation. It really is that, and it's not that difficult. It's about less falling into their traps. It's about working more together so that we get this long-headedness, which I think is a theme for all of us speaking here today, thinking a bit more long-headed, thinking about the future challenges and how they are really, really common to the Euro-Atlantic space. I think this Euro-Atlantic community has to come together much more and to think how to put a better offer, a better alternative offer on the table of these countries that are often the target of Russian and Chinese influence. And this is in the southern neighborhood, in the Western Balkans. And again, once more, a holistic view is needed. Neither military or economic or development instruments alone will do the trick. It has to be comprehensive. It has to be an attractive package, which is not only financial. We've tried that before. It's not the answer. It has to be much more complex than that, and it has to be designed together by the Euro-Atlantic community, simply because, I reiterate, neither organization has all the instruments needed to address these challenges. So again, my plea for more EU-NATO cooperation. This is not easy, but we have to have a grand design for the neighborhood that brings together the UN, that brings together the AU, the EU, NATO, and individual countries themselves. It's not easy by no means, but it is necessary to pull all the threads together. Because it's all connected. So we need to be strategically solidary as well, which I think that's where we have a lot of work to do, and strategically aligned, where again we have a lot of work to do, but I think it's an opportunity now with the strategic reflection processes that are going on in the EU and in NATO as well, and in several individual allies as well, no least the United States. Now on the Western Balkans, that's always tricky. When you talk about NATO and the Western Balkans, because NATO obviously has a very special and often complicated relationship and history with the Western Balkans, normally due to the history with the Western Balkans. But the Western Balkans are at the heart of Europe. They are the heart of Europe. So the need for engagement hasn't been more pressing, I think, than it is now. These countries, I've said it before, like in the southern neighborhood, but perhaps even more acutely in the Western Balkans, these countries are witnessing conflicting narratives of where their country is going, conflicting narratives of strategies of the international rules-based order and of values. And it's simply a playground or a battlefield, depending how you want to describe it, of Russian and Chinese narratives, which are very, very aggressive in the region. So again, we need to put a better offer on the table. And again, it is not only financial. We can't just throw money at these countries and expect that they will do as we say. That's certainly not the solution. And we have to be much more mindful to not take them for granted, to take into consideration their own strategic choices, their own strategic orientations, and to emphasize, again, resilience at home, but then also promoting from how we do resilience at home to promote it in our neighborhood, because it's simply all too connected. So that's what I'd have to say.
Yeah, thanks, Tanya, for emphasizing the need for a holistic approach. And I mean, a holistic, I don't know if we actually use this one or not, but going with the 360, we always have to constantly, throughout the Mediterranean or throughout the Western Balkans, Turkey, keep our head on pivot in terms of the threats that are coming from, now China's the newest, I guess, threat receptor. So, constantly keeping our head on tilt, we can say. So I kind of want to go into the threats that we see from terrorism on the southern flank. Of course, the most recent NATO-US news is the withdrawal from Afghanistan, and certainly that is going to change the overall global threat from terrorism, I'm sure, within the next 5-10 years to come. But I guess today, or I guess if you want to project into 2030, how can NATO and its member states continue to combat terrorism? How can this be incorporated into the strategic concept more so in order to help secure the alliance as a whole? And I guess I'll kind of first go to Roger, if that's okay, if you want to address this question.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. I couldn't resist Tanya's sort of value proposition about we need to offer something better than what they have right now in the Western Balkans. But I think we're starting to really see like a list of concrete evidence that's sort of the veneer of these Silken Road projects going on. This very famous one in Montenegro about how it's a huge amount of their GDP. The workers are always Chinese, and there's not that economic advantage that's always provided to the host country. So I think, Tanya, and I completely agree with you. We need to offer something a little bit better than throwing money at the problem. That's not the solution at all. It's about values and equality, right? And partnership, right? We're all the same, whether you're in Copenhagen or you're down in Tirana, which is not always an easy sell to people. But I think, again, like, we need to make a bigger deal about how these projects are not these, linchpin successes that everybody says they are. They lose money for the Chinese, they lose money for the locals. So, I mean, it's about emphasizing that a little bit. Megan, when it comes to terrorism, I now sound like a broken record going back to sort of my initial input, but a lot of it is about sort of removing the instability there, because whether it's in the Sahel or you see some of the terrible things going on right now in Nigeria with kidnapping for economic purposes, I think in partnership, NATO is not an economic organization like the OECD or the EU or the African Union, but they need to be part of sort of supplying a security aspect of a holistic strategy about providing a better situation on the ground for these people so that there's not the recruitment opportunities for terrorist organizations. People are leaving because they don't have work, because they don't have access to food. And when you get desperate, you make desperate decisions. And I think that's one issue that is very hard to solve, where sort of winning the hearts and mind, which is, as the United States can tell you from Iraq and from Afghanistan, is not an easy proposition. But I think that's where a lot of the efforts need to be focused. And one thing that I just want to go back to is, we always talk about how the member states are not spending enough on new capabilities and 20% on research and development. But your dollar goes so far in investment on these development programs, about setting up, a water well. And I know it sounds farcical sometimes, but I'm so convinced at this point that providing, basic sanitation, protection for women, so that, they feel safe walking through in the middle of the night. Those are all things that NATO needs to consider how they can do more, get out of their comfort zone with partners to do that. Because if people are resilient themselves and they say, well, this is an unattractive offer, I don't want to join a terrorist organization, I have a future for my children, I think it's a winning value proposition. It's a good PR strategy for NATO. And quite frankly, I think it's something that we can get good at. I mean, NATO is 30 member states. I mean, there's a huge opportunity to source expertise. You have tons of countries with immigration backgrounds who can tell you what's working, what's not working. So I think my final comment on that is to sort of remove the opportunity for recruitment collectively with partnerships. And I think tangibly down the line, you'll see a much higher success rate than what you had within these ungoverned spaces in the Sahel and other parts of East Africa.
Yeah, certainly. Thanks, Roger, for your comment. I want to jump to Tanya next and also get the sort of EU perspective of how the EU and NATO can work together across the alliance, in particular on the southern flank, to mitigate these threats from terrorism. And then, of course, if you have any other general comments, please feel free to add.
No, sure. And I think this last question fits very nicely to my initial remarks, where I spoke about how we need to better connect the dots, because this is indeed the answer. If we look at the threat of terrorism, we cannot just look at the threat of people blowing things up. It's much more complex than that. It's, as Roger said, why are they blowing these things up? Why are they resorting to violence and to leaving families behind and to going to other countries to wreak havoc? You have to address the root causes. And I emphasize NATO doesn't have all the instruments to do that, but it has some of them. It has this unique know-how and unique perspective that is needed in order to fight the causes and the consequences of terrorism in the long term, together with other partners. We need to better connect the dots. We need to connect all of these different instruments, and we need to be more inclusive in practice as well. This means that not just writing on paper, yes, lessons learned, yes, we are learning from our partners, but to actually do it. If I'm not mistaken, this was the main criticism of the intervention in Afghanistan, that well, operatives kept kind of reinventing the wheel and not applying the lessons that others have learned before them. So I think this is something that is so easy to say in in an abstract way in an event like this, but it's so crucial to actually start doing it in practice. I think it's just so obvious to say it, but we do need to combine these instruments of development, of business opportunities, humanitarian aid, women, peace and security agenda, training, good governance, anti-corruption, all of these things that are at the basis of, or the root causes of terrorism, of the terrorist threat. And then combine that with military assistance, provided that conditions are met, such as for instance, we see now the European Peace Facility, right, in the EU, this new fund that is going to assist countries by providing military assistance as long as conditions of human rights, rule of law, and so on are respected. These are the kind of things that we need to do. So of course, training the armed forces, providing security sector reform have to be done. And this is where NATO can play a very big role, but it has to be done in parallel with all of these other instruments that I've said, because you can't have one without the other. It's simply not a long-term solution to keep putting out fires. We have to avoid the fire that the fire it happens in the first place. So that would be my answer.
Yeah, definitely. I guess putting out the flame before it ignites actually is probably, I mean, obviously.
That's the one I was going for.
Forward looking. I was gonna say, I'm not even sure that I got it 100% right in the colloquialisms, but yeah, I mean, putting out the fires can only get us so far. And certainly NATO has years and over 20 years of experience, or almost 20 years of experience in Afghanistan. There are certainly many, many lessons that NATO has learned and needs to apply, certainly. And then speaking of also another country that has, much experience working on counterterrorism operations is Turkey. Of course, it's the most widely affected by terrorist organizations and terrorist attacks, being on the border of Syria and Iraq. So Turkey has kind of borne the physical brunt of the threat from terrorism over the years. How can, Savannah, we'll jump to you. How can Turkey sort of, I guess, impart its wisdom onto NATO and, I guess, kind of increase cooperation in the future?
Sure, thanks, Megan. And I agree. I think Roger and Tanya have really reiterated a couple key points that I'll highlight and agree with. But I think in terms of understanding, Turkey certainly has had a majority of the brunt, whether it be from efforts in terms of against or in efforts combating terrorism and counterterrorism efforts, whether it be with ISIS, anti-Daesh coalitions, et cetera. Obviously, right there on the border of Syria has posed a major challenge. But NATO's southern flank in general has a really key different set of dangers. That we've talked about terrorism, even drug gangs, human traffickers obviously are really taking advantage of the displaced people in the region, which is heartbreaking to see. Weapons smugglers, you name it. So they're really planting their seed, taking advantage of the loosely governed areas, ungoverned areas, and the chaos that has really erupted in the MENA Sahel region and the Eastern Mediterranean as well. So threatening peace within those NATO allies, Turkey has certainly, I think, emerged as that leader in the region out of necessity and not really with any choice. Creating stability in these regions really, I think, is important that we understand it requires a different set of tools. It's not just this diplomacy and deterrence that we have in discussing Russia, but realigning with the understanding of the importance of the hub for the South, this designation to provide these more specific tools addressing this, to sustain security, promote this rule of law, and encourage the gains against the economic gains really needed against this terrorist threat. We've touched on human security, we've touched on the migration. I think what's important is to understand that the migration itself is not the problem or the threat. It's a symptom of the larger problems throughout the region. So understanding that we have to understand how to get this migration problem under control in order to really find the root cause of the issues and understand the stability needed in the region. So maximizing this effectiveness, understanding that it requires a different approach, utilizing our allies that we've discussed this entire conversation, the economic leverage that we have and the capabilities there. And something that, I caution sometimes just based off of from the US perspective against the idea of winning the hearts and minds, because I think it's much more difficult to do, but understanding that it does take that political diplomacy. We cannot have, a region or an organization, NATO, whatever it may be, the EU, using refugees or displaced people as political pawns. And I think having this disparity of really not knowing what to do at times, or having a lack of really strategic coherence in addressing these problems, not just in the reaction, but the problem itself of terrorism, of the eruption of conflict in Libya, Syria, and places that have become either a breeding ground for terrorist activities and desperation. Roger, I think you bring up a really key point in that, there's a desperation element involved here of why people are fleeing, why people are feeling like they have no choice but to, have these opportunities. So the recruitment levels are high in some of these places. So understanding kind of more of the specific nuanced conversation, the role of human security and what we have to do, tools that, the Hub for the South, different elements of NATO can utilize that are more, I think, specific instead of stopgap measures from a collective apparatus. We need more specific approaches. I don't have all the answers, certainly, and I don't know if I can propose the perfect solution for every single element, because I think we'd be here all day discussing the more specific situations. But overall, understanding that there's a human element when we talk about the terrorist aspect. And I think, Tanya, you bring up a good point. It's not just people, going to other countries, bombing things or blowing things up. I mean, there's a human element that is so much more personal, from, the horrifying stories of human traffickers, women, young children, families torn apart by what's happening right now in the region. And so if we can have an increased focus on this, I think it's certainly going to make me sleep better at night, but I think it's going to be something that will also build for more cohesion down the line when it comes to NATO and the cooperation of allies in the region.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely key, not forgetting that, we have these discussions on sort of, what can transpire into harder security issues, but at the root, they are very human oriented issues. So thanks, Savannah. On that note, we just have about 4 minutes left. So I kind of just want to get some closing remarks from our speakers. What would you like to leave us with today? I guess we'll start with Roger on that one, and then go from Savannah and then Tanya. Close us out, please. Thank you.
Yeah, so before I get to my point, I think the image that will stick with me the most, Tanya, and you get credit for this one, is Xi Jinping and Putin eating popcorn together. I thought that really stood out for me, sitting on a couch together, watching Netflix and chilling. No, I'm going to go back to my early point, where I think the situation in the Mediterranean from a hard security perspective is legitimate. There is a lot of cause for concern. I don't think it's the priority. But I think if NATO, again, were to assess what the major issue is in 2030, I think it would be sort of trying to come up with a comprehensive, not even comprehensive, but something tangible and pragmatic that they can execute in a short time, that would sort of bring together these actors that we talked about, the expertise with the EU, the African Union, and really cover a lot more of the sort of the soft security issues in the Mediterranean and the countries. I think, again, even on the financial side of it, the money is much better spent in terms of getting to the root causes of the problems early. And then also, I am just a huge subscriber of this problem of climate security, where I think we're making huge headways on it. In 2 days, it's Earth Day coming up. There's going to be a huge climate on it. So I really think long term we're only starting to see the early inklings of what it's going to look like with drought, natural disasters, movement of people, loss of economic opportunities. And again, that's not NATO's primary prerogative, but they need to factor that into their over horizon thinking, into early warning systems. Because if anything we've learned, from 2014 or earlier, getting to these problems early is not only cost effective, but it's more effective in terms of its strategy and mission success. So I'm going to leave it on that and try to go hang out with Xi and Putin with popcorn.
Can I jump in here, Megan? Yes, I agree. The popcorn imagery, Roger, you also talked about, the squeezing of the juice and whether it's worth it or not. So I have, you guys are talking about food here. Megan Baklava, I think it's lunchtime for us here, so I will be brief. But, jokes aside, I think the importance of what we have been talking about, whether it be Turkey's role, the role of allies and, the EU, the African Union, a number of different, human security elements, soft security issues that have to take priority. I'm an optimist inherently, and so I want to be optimistic and say that we are making strides. And I am really proud to see of the importance of inclusive practices of policy. So regardless of whether you think the southern flank is the priority, of various other theaters that need to take more precedence, that's fine. But I think this conversation speaks to the overall consensus that there is an understanding of comprehensive collaboration needed, but also who's at the table discussing these policies. Secretary General Stoltenberg has really emphasized, and what I have loved to see, what you are part of, Tanya, in this empowerment of youth leaders, of youth voices, of people who are directly in the field, of the inclusive aspects of women in international security, and at the conversation at the table, the forefront of this dialogue. So I hope that we are able to see these reports put into practice in terms of what I think we have all discussed in cooperation and collaboration, and understanding that there are preventative measures that need to be put into place. I want to avoid any opportunity for Putin and Xi Jinping to be sitting on a couch eating popcorn. I don't want that to happen. So I think that when we have this productive cooperation and collaboration, but also specific measures, specific tools, whether it be economic, whether it be soft or hard diplomacy levels, I want to see these proposals, as I mentioned in my last comment, become off the paper, off the digital screen. I want to see these put into practice. And I think that it's going to take time and effort, and maybe with the coronavirus and the global pandemic, we're going to see a little bit of stalling in that. But I hope to see these, these aspects of real potential for momentum move forward. And I want to thank the Atlantic Forum and Megan for hosting this important conversation. I've learned a lot, and I look forward to staying in touch with you all.
Well, tough to follow after Savannah. I'm not sure that Xi Jinping and Putin munching popcorn was my best moment, but anything to put a smile on your faces. Maybe to end, because I think Savannah has said it all. I think now is not the time for NATO and the EU to practice what you, Roger, have learned in Thessaloniki, which is the art of doing nothing. I think they should practice the opposite, the art of working together. So those are my final famous words. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you all for your closing remarks. And just one more comment on the popcorn with Xi Jinping and Putin is that one could only hope that they're watching the NATO YouTube channels, or many YouTube channels from NATO institutions. They always have a very lively video. So hopefully they can learn something about the alliance a bit. Although, of course, the going to Sun Tzu, knowing your enemy is part of the defeat or the way to defeat your enemy. So hopefully they're not learning that much so that they can defeat the alliance. But I think that we have many reasons to be optimistic, and that NATO is adapting to the many threats. And today we can see that definitely there's room for improvement on the southern flank, but we are very optimistic that NATO will sort of expand and keep its head on that 360-degree turn. So I thank everyone for coming today. I would like to thank all of our speakers, Tanya, Roger, Savannah. Thank you so much for joining us today. It was really a huge treat to have this discussion. I wanted to remind everyone that our next discussion in the NATO 2030 series will be focused on Afghanistan later in May. You can check out the Atlantic Forum's social media, or if you're a patron, you're receiving our newsletter, so you'll know certainly when that will be coming. And thank you all again so much for joining us. And I hope you have a nice evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you are today. And